we discussed for the last 2 weeks the first dimension, the first element, the first, to use our analogy, the first speaker that needed to be adjusted that so that the life of Jesus could be seen and heard properly. And what we did over the last 2 weeks is we adjusted the speaker that dealt with the life of Jesus being the climax of the story of Israel. Tonight we begin with the second dimension, or the second speaker, which is that the story of Jesus is the story of Israel's God. So the first speaker that I said was turned way down, and that we needed to turn up, was the story of Jesus is the climax or the answer to the question that's kind of ended in the Old Testament, that Jesus is the end of Israel's story. Tonight we're going to begin looking at, tonight and next week, Lord willing, looking at the fact that the story of Jesus is the story of Israel's God. Specifically, it is the story of Israel's God coming back to his people as he always promised. And we hinted about this at the end of last week. Now, the first point in your notes tonight is distorted noise. And I want to say a few words about the volume that's coming from this speaker, okay? In the West, okay, in the Western culture, when we read the Gospels, what we've done with this speaker is we have turned it up so loud that it becomes distorted and drowns out so much of the rest of the music. So last couple weeks we've said the volume is turned so far down that we can't even hear that. This one is turned so high up that it gets very much distorted and we can't even hear what it's really doing. And let me explain how we kind of got to that place. Skepticism, especially skepticism that grew out of the Enlightenment era. Christians in the West began feeling concerned and began having a desire to prove that Jesus was God. What happened after the Enlightenment period is people began questioning, okay, what kind of God is in charge of all this? What branched out of that was deism. Deism is the belief that God created everything, he wound up everything, created everything, and then he just backed off and let it happen. It's what Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson believed, was deism. Just that God set things in motion, but he's not intricately controlling and supernaturally working on earth. And so Christians began being bothered by this, and what continued to flow and what we've seen a rise of in the last, my goodness, 100 years is atheism has grown, especially in the West. And so Christians have been very determined to prove not only is there a God, but that Jesus is in fact God. But when we crank up that volume on this, that Jesus is God, what has gotten distorted is, what God are we talking about? And what is this God now doing? What God are we dealing with? So it's not good enough for us just to be concerned in proving Jesus is God. We've got to answer questions like, what God are we talking about? And what is this God now doing? So we are super happy to talk about Jesus being God in some sense, but less ready to hear what the God of Israel has promised to do in relationship to his sovereign rule in the world. And as we mentioned last week, far too long, Christians have told the story of Jesus and they bypass it. They bypass Israel and they link it to the first 3 chapters only of the Bible. Right? Adam and Eve fall, Adam and Eve fail. So now we've got this problem, and then God does a whole bunch of stuff with Israel, but what really is important is that Jesus comes to fix the problem from Genesis 1 through 3. And we don't link it to the story of Israel. That's what we talked about for 2 weeks, and it's going to continue tonight. We see the story of Israel so often or we're tempted to, is to see the story of Israel like a failed attempt on God's part to sort out the world. So Genesis 1 through 3 happens. Oh no, everything's messed up. So we're going to attempt to fix it, God says, and we'll fix it with Israel. And oh no, that messes up. And so now we'll send Jesus. The different strategy. Jesus was the plan B strategy. The plan A strategy, or maybe even a plan C. Plan A was for there to be never have any sin. Plan B was Israel, we'll use Israel to fix it. And plan C was Jesus. Or there's sin, and plan A was Israel, and plan B was Jesus. But this is not the biblical story. This is not the biblical story of God. So I think we should take the rest of our time tonight to look at that story. And not just Israel's story, but the story of Israel's God. What God are we talking about? And what is this God doing on the earth? And how that links to what the Gospels write. And then what we will do next week is we will go back to the Gospels and we will dig in to find how it is God coming back to Israel as he always promised. So, before we get into the story tonight, recognize the West has gone to this speaker that says Jesus is God, and we have cranked it up so loud, Jesus God, Jesus God, Jesus God, Jesus God, that what we have distorted is, what God are we talking about? What's the plan of God? How God is bringing about his purposes on the earth? That is ultimately very, very important. So, I want to talk about the biblical story of God. Make no mistake about it. Humanity and the story of humanity is not really the story of humanity. It is the story of God. It is the story of what God is doing. And the Bible tells about Israel's God in a quite different way than many Christians have told the story. So let's look at the biblical story of God. Some of this we have talked about before, we have mentioned before, but I think it's very important for us to do it once again before we get into the actual gospel text next week. It's good for us to be reminded of this and to go over it and make sure we've got this story straight in our mind. Number one, we're going to start with the covenant of Abraham. In the biblical story, the Creator God, okay? Let's start there. The Creator God, the one who made the heavens and the earth, comes to a man named Abram. From now on, I'll just call him Abraham. You know it got changed. Comes to a man named Abraham, who lived in present day. Anybody know? Present day Iraq. Present day Iraq. That's where he lived. And God tells him, I need you to basically become a wandering nomad. I need you to leave your family, for the most part, your home. I need you to leave the security of everything you've had, and I need you to become a wandering nomad in the direction that I tell you to go, which ultimately we know as Israel or Palestine area. So God calls this man out and says, Abraham, by the way, Abraham was a pagan worshiper of the moon god. It's not like Abraham was this, super righteous guy that looked down and God said, ooh, there's a really righteous guy. No, he chose Abraham. He called Abraham out and he sent him in the direction of Israel or Palestine that we know today. And this God makes a covenant with Abraham containing some of the most dramatic and some of the most grand promises we see in all of the Bible. And we read about these covenants from Genesis 12 to really Genesis chapter 24. We read some of these different promises that God makes. The Creator God tells Abraham, I will make you into a great nation. So I'm calling you out from the people that you have lived with. I'm moving you to a different area, and I am going to make you a great nation. And this nation is going to live in this promised land, this land that I am going to give you. Later on, he tells Abraham, your ancestors will be like the sand of the seashore or the stars of the sky. There will simply be too many of them to count. And that certainly goes along with the promise to make you a great nation. I'm going to make you a great nation, and this nation is going to be so great that you're going to have so many ancestors that it's going to be like stars in the sky or grains of sand on the seashore. But then God says something that goes far and beyond just one nation. God then says to Abraham, you will be a father of many nations. And through you, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. You want to talk about a grand promise? You want to talk about a huge promise? God is saying, through you, Abraham, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to have your ancestors are going to be so many. It's like stars in the sky, sands on the seashore. In fact, I'm going to make you the father of many nations. In fact, through you, all the nations of the world are going to be blessed. Now, this covenant, which starts in chapter 12 of Genesis, follows on the heels of Genesis 3 through 11. Genesis 3 through 11 is the folly and the wickedness of humanity. It results in chapter 11 with God. I mean, he destroys them, right, with the flood. Then in chapter 11, he takes humanity and he scatters them, divides the human race after they build the Tower of Babel. So, the story of God and Abraham, listen to this carefully. The story of God and Abraham is the starting point for the whole of the rest of the biblical narrative. And it's turning what has come before it. So we need to get the story of God here right. Israel's God is not starting to fix things when Jesus comes. Right? It's not that God goes, okay, I'm going to send Jesus and that's when I'll start fixing stuff. He started the fixing stuff in Genesis chapter 12. That's where God begins the story of his redemption, the story of him setting things right. God is now, through Abraham, going to undo the plight of the human race. He will enable human beings to pick up the project, the commission that they had been given by God at the beginning, but was ruined because of man's rebellion. Because of man's rebellion, they did not do the commission that God had given them, and so God is going to start and he's going to enable the human race to pick up the threads of that project and begin to do it right. And he begins it in Genesis chapter 12. It doesn't begin with Jesus. He begins it in Genesis chapter 12. Next thing I want us to look at is the dwelling place of God. So now we're going to go back to Genesis chapter 1. There is an aspect of the creation story that I think so many people miss, especially people in the West. We miss some elements of the creation story that I think are vitally important. A core of it, if you will. If you were here for our Matthew chapter 24 series called The Signs of the Son, our very first session was all about the temple of God. And we followed the temple narrative from the very beginning all the way to Matthew 24 when the temple was promised to be destroyed. The original creation story has God making a dwelling place for himself. Okay? It has God making a dwelling place for himself. In 6 days or 6 stages of creation, if you have any understanding of the ancient East world, which most of us in the West don't, right? We are not experts of the ancient Near East. So we don't understand some of the things that they did. We don't understand the history. If you understand how the ancient Near East people viewed creation, viewed worship of God, viewed God's interaction with earth, our creation story is going to make more sense. In 6 days or 6 stages of creation, God, in creation itself, heaven and earth together, becomes a kind of temple, a dwelling place for God. In all the ancient empires, that's exactly what they believed their temples were. They believed they were creating a temple, and then they would create a statue for that God, and they would place that statue in that temple, and that is where their God would manifest himself, right, through the statue. It was like the means by which, but they believed that this temple was the place where their gods would come and meet them. That's how all the ancient pagans in the Near East viewed their temples. So now let's go to the creation story and let's think about this for a minute. God creates earth. He creates Eden. And guess what he does in Eden? The ancient Near East people would take an image of their God and they would place it in their temple, right? What did God do in Genesis chapter 1? Did he not create a garden temple for himself where he would manifest, and he created image bearers of himself to be placed in that garden? Image bearers of God placed in the temple, which is heaven and earth coming together, and human beings were supposed to reflect him, to bring his creativity to birth in the entire world, to reflect praise and glory and honor of the world back to the Creator. That's what we were created to do as image bearers of God. We were supposed to take the glory of God all over the world, the presence of God all over the world. But God starts it with a garden temple, Eden, and places his image bearers in it and tells us to worship him. That, of course, is the heart of the story. We talked about the human commission before. The human commission is to take the glory of God all over the world. It never changed from the very beginning until right now. The commission has remained the same. It has been worked out now differently than it was then because we have the gospel of Jesus Christ, but the commission is the same. Take the glory of God all over the world. So, what God does at the very beginning is he creates a place where heaven and earth are together in this garden temple that we call the Garden of Eden, with his image bearers in it that are supposed to reflect praise back to him and are supposed to take the glory of God all over the world. Now, humanity spoils that temple. Humanity rebels as image bearers of God. And then we go to number 3, the Exodus. One might suppose that the original intention of God, that maybe God lost sight of the entire plan because of the story that comes after Genesis. You read through Genesis and then you have this story that we call the Exodus story. I mean, we literally have a book of the Bible that we call Exodus. We have this Exodus story, and you almost think for a second that maybe God's lost sight of the plan from the very beginning that he had in Genesis 1. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob find that God appears to them now and again in different ways. Sometimes they mark that spot with a stone or a shrine or an altar. But then the story takes a massive nosedive into straight chaos. As Joseph is sold into slavery in Egypt, And though this saves his family initially from the famine, the long-term result is 400 years of slavery of the Jewish people, the Israelite people. It's so easy to think, in the midst of that story, God must have redirected his entire thing that he's doing. But the Bible says, at the end of that 400 years, what does the Bible say God remembers? What does he say he remembers? His covenant with who? Abraham. God says, I remember my covenant with Abraham. He passes sentence on the Egyptians. He rescues Israel through the amazing events of the Passover and under the leadership of Moses. God delivers them out. And then as they get to Mount Sinai, God gives Israel the law to be the way of life for this rescued people. Of course, what do they do while God's giving them the law, which is to be the way of life for the rescued people? What are they doing? They're worshiping false god. They're worshiping an idol. Right? I mean, think about it. You see the story here? What were they supposed to be in the garden? Image bearers of God, reflecting the glory of God, worshiping God, praise, taking his glory all over the world. Then God delivers them out. He's setting up the new nation, and the nation, right at the very beginning, is refusing to be the image bearers of God that worship and praise God and take his glory all over the world. However, God, being a God of grace, and because Moses goes to God and intercedes for them, God does an astonishing thing. In the book of Exodus, God himself accompanies Israel, accompanies this people on their journey, gives them instructions for a tabernacle, the holy tent of meeting, where he will be present in their midst and where he will meet with them. Okay? Let's catch the story of Israel's God. He creates a garden temple, heaven and earth together, where he meets with human beings. Human beings rebel and sin against that. God is going to fix his story. His plan is for his glory and his fame and his praise to be all over the world. And so what he does is he calls Abraham, and he promises that through Abraham, I'm going to bless all the nations. We know the way that you bless all the nations is for God to have people who worship him in all the nations. Revelation says people from every tribe, nation, language, tongue. That's what God's doing. But he starts here with Abraham. Abraham, the story of Abraham leads to bondage. God brings them out of Egyptian bondage. And God goes with them as they're traveling to where? The promised land. And he gives them instructions for a tabernacle where he will meet with them, where he will manifest himself in a temple. He manifested himself in a temple of Eden. Now he's going to manifest himself in this temple that they call a tabernacle, or the tent of meeting. Eventually, the tabernacle is built, and the glory of Israel's God comes to fill it and to live among his people as they journey to the promised land. Israel is supposed to be, catch this now, Israel is supposed to be a new humanity on their way to take possession of a new Eden. Okay? That's what they were doing. I'm giving you a land flowing with milk and honey. I'm giving you a land that is bountiful and beautiful, and you are to be my image bearers here. I am going to meet with you in the temple. I'm going to give my presence and manifest. I'm going to meet with you like I did at the very beginning with Adam and Eve. Yes, it's going to be different now because it's been marred by sin, but the story is continuing. Number 4, the temple. This pattern of God intending to live with his people and being unable to do so because of their sin and their rebellion, but then God coming back again because of grace, is the story of the entire Old Testament. Let me repeat that once again. The pattern of God intending to live among his people, but being unable to do so because of their rebellion, but coming back again because of grace, is the story of the entire Old Testament. It is the story of Israel's God. I come to my humanity that I make in this garden temple, this beautiful garden temple with no sin and perfection, but yet you rebel and you sin, and so I have to cast you away. But then I'm going to remedy all this because I'm going to make a covenant with Abraham. And Abraham's people are eventually going to be the Israelites. Through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob's name changed to Israel. We go back to captivity in Egypt. We come out of captivity. God dwells with his people. But then over and over and over again, they rebel. This is the story. This is the pattern. And then God leaves them and then comes back to them again. It's the pattern over and over and over again. Solomon. What does Solomon get to build? The temple, right? He gets to build the Jewish temple. And if you go and you read, when the manifest glory of God comes upon that temple, it says that the priest and the temple workers have to leave the temple because the presence of God in that temple is so immense and glorious. They can't even stand to be in it. Not the Holy of Holies. The entire temple has to be evacuated because God's presence gets poured down on there, even in a greater way than it did with the tabernacle. And unfortunately, generations after generations corrupt the temple because of their rebellion and their idolatry. God eventually abandons the temple altogether. Do you know where in the story God abandons the temple altogether? It's when Babylon is coming to attack Israel. And God's already told them, you're going to go into Babylonian captivity for 70 years. And I'm taking my presence and I'm leaving the temple. And he leaves the temple and Jerusalem to the fate of the Babylonians. Of course, we know what happens then. There is this era that we call Second Temple Judaism. Okay? Second Temple Judaism. It is the time after Babylonian captivity, roughly 538 BC, where there is divine absence and God never comes back again. Okay? When they come out of Babylonian captivity, we talked about this last week, but when they came out of Babylonian captivity and they go back to Jerusalem and they rebuild Jerusalem and they rebuild the temple, the presence of God never comes in that temple the way that it had done with Solomon, the way that it had done in the tabernacle, and the way that it had been in Eden. It never happens. We talked about last week, they continued to see themselves in exile, didn't they? They're waiting for their Jubilee. Their ultimate Jubilee to happen. Well, God has abandoned the temple. This is the problem that Israel faced. Malachi talks about the priests are slack in their duties because though they've rebuilt the temple, there is no sense in which Yahweh has returned. The way that Ezekiel said he would. Ezekiel said he's coming back, he's going to pour out his glory on us. It's going to be glorious, it's going to be beautiful. This is what God is going to do. But in the second temple, it never happens. It never happens. God is gone, and he hasn't come back again. The Hebrew Scriptures as a whole end with this hope that a larger scale story that mirrors the previous stories is coming. Israel looked at the story of their God and said, Our God met with Adam and Eve in the garden. Our God met with us in the tabernacle. Our God met with us in the temple. Yes, he kept leaving because of our wickedness and sin, but he always came back to us. And they rebuilt the temple, and they were going, okay, he's going to do it again. This is God's story. This is what he does for us. He comes back. And God never came back after they rebuilt that temple. And Israel was waiting for what had been the prototypical narrative all throughout the Old Testament of God coming to his people because he made them a promise, them rebelling and pulling his presence away, and then in his grace coming back to his people, manifesting himself in his glory again, because the ultimate plan of God is for his glory to be all over the world. They're waiting for this similar ending. The problem is nobody knows how or exactly when God is going to do this. The story that the Gospels are telling, this is where we've been leading up to, which many people have only been shouting, Jesus is God, Jesus is God, Jesus is God. Again, is there anything wrong with proving the deity of God from the Gospels? Of course not. Don't leave here and think Neil doesn't want us to focus on Jesus being divine. That's stupid. But we got the volume so turned up in only screaming, Jesus is God, Jesus is God, Jesus is God, that we have missed that this is the story of Yahweh coming back to his people once again. Have you ever sung at Christmas time, O come, Emmanuel? It sounds kind of weird to us in the West, doesn't it? O come, Emmanuel. O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel. We're like, captive what? They still saw themselves as captive. To take the gloomy... I got to sing it. I can't remember the words off the top of my head. If I don't hum it in my mind, I can't remember it. The gloomy clouds of night.
Mom's singing it.
Keep going. Clouds of night. And death's dark shadow put to flight. Rejoice. But in the West, we hear that and we don't really know what to do with that. We're like, no, Jesus came to save everybody. What is this, O come, Emmanuel, to ransom captive Israel stuff? I thought Jesus was coming for everybody. Because we've turned up the volume so loud in Jesus just being God and separated him from what he was doing with Israel and just going Genesis 1 through 3, Jesus. Coming to fix the human race. That we miss that Yahweh is coming back to his people, Israel, to once again manifest himself, now in the greatest manifestation that he has ever given, in human flesh, Jesus, the temple in flesh. And when we did our series on Matthew 24, I told you, why did the temple have to be destroyed? Why did the second temple, right, 538 BC, why did it have to be destroyed in 70 AD? Because his people, who he came to, received him not. And his people continued to worship in the building instead of worshiping the temple who was actually right there walking and talking with them. And as judgment, God said, that temple's going to fall. I'm not manifesting myself in that temple. I did not come to dwell in temple made by human hands. Stephen, that's what he preaches to them before he's killed. This earth is my temple. And my image bearers are in it. And they are spreading my glory. And they are praising my name. The story of Israel's God coming back to his people once again If all we do is crank up the volume that distorts that it's just Jesus is God, Jesus is God, Jesus is God, there's going to be a whole lot of things that we read in the stories of the Gospels that we're going to go, what does that mean? And when we're going to do what we always do, which is the first question we ask is, how does that apply to me? Which is not the first question we should ask when we read the Bible. How does this apply to me? The first question we ought to ask is, what was meant to the original audience when they read this? That's the first question we ought to ask. When we ask that question in light of this dimension that we talked about tonight, some things are going to make more sense to us.